This is Yesterzine, where old games have one day left until retirement. We play the best and worst reviewed games from an old gaming magazine and pass 2019 era judgment, as well as highlighting the moments that changed gaming. Today we open a copy of issue 28 of PC Zone from July 1995. PC Zone was, for want of a good explanation, something of the Amiga power of PC mags. The anarchic, sometimes slightly lads, alternative to the more straight-laced PC gamer. Eventually they would both be future publishing mags, but at this point Zone was still safely in its original home at Lynne Publishing. If this season of Yesterzine has a theme, it's the difficult translation of gaming to the 3D and CD era, and this lies right in the middle of the PC's struggles with that. The gaming hell is one of the last mainstream gasps of the full motion video game, and the cover feature is going to neatly date all of us. The gaming heaven though? Well, it's the first appearance of one of the all-time classic series, and features my first encounter with one of the game soundtrack greats. If I tell you that's Frank Klepacki, a bunch of you are ahead of us, or, to be fair, read the magazine cover on screen a minute ago. For the rest of you, the few of you who watched the embarrassingly unpopular Yesterzine Extra about Cryo's Dune adventure game will remember it was developed at the same time as an internally competing project called Dune 2, a real-time strategy game. That game is credited with mainstreaming real-time strategy games as a genre, just like I'm trying to mainstream mainstreaming as a verb. It was so pioneering in the genre that developers Westwood had to come up with a name while trying to explain it to the press. Co-founder Brett Sperry and his team went through several combinations of war, strategy and real-time while attempting to define what it is they were doing. The work they'd done on RPG Eye of the Beholder was a key inspiration, and Brett described the original kicking around of ideas for the game.
This is how many of my visions for a new game start. It's always, what if you had this and that, or wouldn't it be hellaciously cool if...
Between the license and the sheer quality of Dune 2, Westwood were very much on the map as a development team to watch. But it's this, their next project, that would come to define them. Joking that the development team were tired of sand, they decided to make a real-time strategy game in their own universe, tweaking Dune's competing feminist dynamic to two distinct factions. There's the Global Defense Initiative, or GDI, essentially the world government, and scary terrorist faction, the Brotherhood of Nod. Westwood made this choice both to avoid using any specific real-world reference, but also because of the political climate of the time. The next quarter century would of course rather validate that decision. Much like Dune 2's start had been Eye of the Beholder, but what if? So Command & Conquer would be spawned the same way from Dune 2. Barry again.
The ideas for Command & Conquer were developing even as we were finishing Dune 2. We learned a lot whilst we were making Dune 2, just as it is with every game. You always get to the end of a project and think, next time we'd love to do this, this and this. Command & Conquer was the net result of the Dune 2 wish list.
One of the major innovations that Command & Conquer became known for were its video-based cutscenes for intro and story clips between missions, most people's first in a mission-based game. Perhaps an inevitable evolution after the video footage-based games like Night Trap, people started looking for ways to integrate full-motion video properly, and Command & Conquer was one of the first to do it. They have a reputation for adorable campness, but that's mostly due to the later games, where the team increasingly leaned into this reputation, calling in professional actors like Tim Curry, George Takei, Trisha Helfer from Battlestar Galactica and Jennifer Morrison from House MD, with seemingly explicit instructions to chew the scenery.
To defend the USSR in this difficult hour, because I need a commander who does not believe in defeat. Someone who will not simply drive our enemies back, but ultimately annihilate them, humiliate them, and show them no mercy.
The first game, though, they had neither the budget nor the reputation. The cutscenes of Command & Conquer only have one professional actor, Joseph Kuchen.
Yes. Power shifts more quickly than some people think. I am Kane. When I get your troops back from the States, I want you to take what men you have left and secure this abandoned GDI base. Once in, build up an arsenal of weapons and use them to wipe out the remaining GDI presence. Oh, and congratulations on your promotion.
Kukan worked before with Westwood on the Legend of Corandia adventure games and would also direct the videos for the game. The rest of the cast are all Westwood employees, and effectively the scenes were filmed wherever they could find space. In warehouses, spare bedrooms and meeting rooms. It was not meant to be camp, but there's a lo-fi feel to a lot of it. Nonetheless, it was a masterstroke. If there's one thing anyone remembers about the Command & Conquer series, it was these videos. As for the game itself, then this is what the original looks like. As it runs on DOSBox exactly as well as a Greyhound doesn't, this is actually the PlayStation version, which shares the original PC's 320x200 resolution. Fine at the time, but pretty awful now. We could probably throw something together in VirtualBox, but if we're putting in that kind of effort, we can do better. A year later, Westwood released a Windows 95 native version. This runs properly in Windows 10 with a little bit of legwork on compatibility options and a couple of community patches. This is it running in 1024x768. You don't want to go much above that, mainly because even the largest levels aren't that much bigger, and it gets itself very confused. You can see some of the graphical issues even in this capture on the right hand side. With this, and images of the original CDs, then you get all the mission videos and can at least play the whole game full screen, or in a window. And what you immediately discover is an RTS that feels a lot fresher than it has any right to. The mission videos add a lot actually. I played a little without them, and the text-based screen it drops down to just doesn't convey nearly as well the atmosphere of what's going on. It's perhaps unsurprising, while Dune 2 was there first, most of what we expect from this type of game these days was pretty much invented by this one. And even now it feels like a modern indie game in many ways, running in a window with lower size and retro graphics and that slight air of campness. Where it gives itself away is various quality of life improvements. For instance, there's no build queue at all. In almost any RTS these days, with the cannon fodder lowest level units, you order 15 at a time. You can't do that here. You have to go and click them every time you're told one has been built. It has the effect of changing your tactics. The work required to build an army larger than your mum means that you do tend to go for the higher value units just to have less downtime, as you're often a little bit busy when panic building. It's also a little fiddly. It doesn't scroll with keys, just with moving the mouse to the edge of the screen, which isn't always great on a modern large monitor where you're really mostly focusing on only a part of it. Running it in a higher resolution than it was meant to also means it's very easy to not click on something you're trying to attack, and instead deselect all your units. This is especially important since, unlike more modern games, your units are not especially inclined to attack enemies that are beside them unless you order it. The early levels play a bit like cannon fodder, as you just move dudes around the board. But very quickly you get into the meat of the game, where you also have to build a base, with structures such as the barracks or Hand of Nod for producing dudes, the refining centre for harvesting operations, and various defensive and communication structures that are unlocked as you progress. We need to take a moment here to talk about the game's soundtrack. Because while CD obviously gave us access to those fuzzy, low-resolution, full-motion videos, it also gave us access to CD quality sound, which is still basically about cutting edge in terms of audio. Music had been something of an afterthought in a lot of games. The despairing cry of the composer back on the Amiga was always that they were doing their work using a tiny amount of memory for samples. Now suddenly they could just compose music and have it in a thing. Command & Conquer takes full advantage of this. Frank Klepacki's masterpiece of a 22-track soundtrack is a huge part of the appeal of the game. It's the bit that really did feel next generation about it, and I have no shame in saying it's still part of the rotation on my phone a quarter of a century down the road from when I first heard it. I mean, listen to it. Or, even better, watch Frank and his band the Tiberium Sons play some of it live. Don't get me wrong, I love the music the Amiga, C64, SNES and Mega Drive produced, but in 1995 this was a revelation. I really believe the story of this season of Yesterzine and this period in history is probably gaming's one true generational shift. You could say it was 2D versus 3D, but we get mainstream 2D games in 2019. What I think really is the story of when you had to scrape for every byte of storage in a game, and then suddenly when you didn't have to anymore. This is the point where gaming's horizons near instantly opened in a way they'd never done before and would never truly do so again. So you'd assume I'm going to say you should play this in 2019. Well no, I'm not. But don't worry, it's for the best of reasons. Excitingly, Command & Conquer and its first sequel spin-off, Red Alert, are being remade by a team at Petroglyph Games for release in 2020. The team includes several Westwood veterans, including, most pleasingly for this show, Frank Klepacki. We await it with almost inappropriately affectionate interest. If you want to get ahead of the game though, use the Windows 95 version, known as Command & Conquer Gold. There are 3 reasons for this. Firstly, this is a Windows native version and thus a lot easier to get running, as well as being higher resolution. Secondly, it's free. No really. Westwood released it as freeware almost 12 years ago now. Have a Google and you'll be able to download exactly what I've been playing here for yourself. There's even a couple of community improved versions that use the data files. If you're using Windows 10, those are a necessity. And lastly, using the Windows-based re-release provides a very pleasing narrative continuity to this episode. Because these days, we assume the PC version of any given game is probably the prettiest. Consoles are designed using mostly PC-derived parts to a budget after all, and are then static for 6 or 7 years, notwithstanding this generation's appearances of the Xbox One X and PlayStation 4 Pro. That didn't used to be the case. PCs were very general computing machines back then and used very generic parts. The consoles, with their custom chips, traditionally ran rings around them early on. When the NES launched with games like Super Mario Bros. That looked like this, the PC was still back on CGA, with its 4 colour shades of cyan and pink, as here in Grand Prix Circuit. When the SNES launched with the fancy 3D Mode 7 of F-Zero, the PC was still barely getting parallax scrolling. The same happened in 1994 with the launch of the PlayStation. PCs, relying as they did on software rendering, had no answer to this. Plus, PCs were still using the text-based operating system MS-DOS for almost all games. Thanks to an arcane memory model from the days where 640k was enough for everyone, games that required more than that could be an utter cow to get running, and some people were still having to use game-specific boot disks. Nonetheless, the PC gaming market was starting to properly take off. While the PC had a measure of coverage in magazines like Ace and the pre-Amiga version of the One, it was 1993 when it started to get its own magazines, like PC Gamer, whose premiere issue we looked at last season. As the 8 and then 16-bit computers were being replaced as pure gaming machines by the consoles, so their edge in productivity had gone, and people looking to do serious work were largely ignoring the 32-bit Amiga 1200 and Atari Falcon in favour of buying PCs. And of course, once they did, they still wanted to play games on them. 2 things were needed: a graphical operating system that everyone could use, and a unified driver model so games wouldn't have to individually support every combination of hardware out there. We had Windows 3.1 of course by this point, but it wasn't designed for games, which always tried to bypass it and use the direct access to the hardware that MS-DOS allowed. The perils of this were neatly demonstrated when some arcane hardware on compact Presarios running Windows 3.1 caused Disney's Lion King game to constantly crash. This problem was made somewhat more serious because Disney's Lion King game was included free with compact Presarios. This was later traced to some weirdness with a Cirrus Logic graphics chip that Compaq used, but the damage was very much already done. In 1995, Microsoft had the solution, and the impending release of that solution was covered in PC Zone this month. They replaced MS-DOS on Windows with a new, unified, single PC operating system called Windows 95. The first appearance of the iconic Start menu and the first version of Windows even remotely recognisable to today's young'uns, Windows 95 supported new hardware, and a then laughably impossible 480 megabytes of RAM, the same as some 240 PlayStations. Windows 95 was not perfect. It was still hamstrung by the need to support MS-DOS-based programs as much as possible. They were still the overriding majority of programs, especially games, after all. The article in PC Zone was mostly concerned with how well those DOS games could run in the new OS, which was normally pretty well, with at least a slightly easier configuration process and no more individual boot disks. While the DOS support wouldn't finally leave until Windows 9X and Windows NT merged with Windows 2000, 95 brought true multitasking to the PC, and Commodore and Atari would never recover.
Oh, well, that's easier than changing dry cleaners. I mean, you know, you always leave something behind. Now, below that...
The missing piece was still native Windows games, though. 3 Microsoft employees, Craig Eisler, Alex St. John, and Eric Engstrom, took the initiative, and with permission to spend just 4 months on the project, they went to work on a collection of application programming interfaces, or APIs, that would allow Windows games safe access much closer to the hardware. The APIs were all given the name Direct. There was, initially, Direct Draw, Direct Sound, and Direct Play. The team named the project the Game SDK, but reporters took to slightly mocking the Direct naming and inadvertently gave the project the name that would eventually stick, DirectX. They made their impossible deadline. Just. The first DirectX beta only worked on one absurdly high-spec ATI graphics card and only made its April 1995 trade show deadline thanks to Craig playing fast and loose with several traffic laws in Eric's Mazda RX-7. It worked though, and in October 1995, Microsoft were able to launch DirectX. It wasn't perfect, but it was the foundation for games on Windows 95, and was enough to essentially kill DOS as a mass-market gaming platform inside 2 years. 2 years which included the releases of DirectX 2, 3, and, thanks to incredibly tight deadlines meaning a major version was skipped, 5. The story from there will no doubt visit another time in more detail, but with this stable driver base across the whole operating system, manufacturers started to produce PC graphics cards with more and more features. The tipping point, where the PC gained a supremacy in technical terms it was never to relinquish, happened in late 1996, when 3DFX launched the Voodoo 3D add-on graphics card. Suddenly, the PC had abilities only the consoles had before this point, and it had it in higher resolutions, and with anyone able to code and release a game without getting the permission of a platform holder. In 1999, the second milestone came, as Nvidia launched the first integrated single graphics card that could do object transformation and lighting on board. The GeForce series suddenly became the graphics card of choice in most PCs, and it remains so to this day. All because games can count that by targeting DirectX, it will work. There's one final twist to this tale. As the PlayStation aged, Microsoft pondered if a standalone games-playing PC might be a good addition to the market. They dipped a toe in the water by providing a cut-down portable Windows to Sega for its Dreamcast console, but it was Sony they were scared of. The just-announced PS2 contained support for all kinds of home media, including DVD and the ability to run Linux, and Microsoft felt that a threat. They commissioned the design of a console which used a customised Pentium 3 processor, a graphics chip from Nvidia modelled on a 3rd generation GeForce, and which would control its hardware using a modified version of DirectX. The machine was named the Direct Xbox, later shortened in a way you are no doubt very familiar with. So there we have it. The bright idea of 3 engineers not only resulted in the PC essentially wiping out every personal computer as a game-playing entity, but also the name, and possibly existence, of the only truly successful non-Japanese games console series. It's a funny parallel to the PlayStation's creation though, a machine that also only existed because a company backed an engineer's idea. There's probably an entire management textbook in these stories, but if a couple of board members had one fewer coffee or a slightly worse commute to work one day, maybe the games industry would never have got Xbox or PlayStation. And who knows what would be playing instead. For every Spice Girls, there is a The Saturdays. For every Marmite, there is a Vegemite. For every Finding Nemo, there's a Shark Tale. If something is vaguely successful or good, there will always be someone who tries to imitate it but cocks up the whole thing royally. In the world of full-motion video games, we've already looked at the kings, Digital Pictures. They basically invented the genre back in 1988, and they went on to produce games such as Night Trap, Ground Zero Texas, Corpse Killer, and Double Switch. All 4 of those have had recent re-releases and are still spoken of to this day. For every Digital Pictures, there is a Rocket Science Games. It shouldn't have been that way. Rocket Science Games came into being in a flurry of excitement and funding. Having done well with Sewer Shark and Night Trap, with Ground Zero Texas and Double Switch imminent, all of which contributed pretty heavily to the relative success of the Mega CD, Sega wanted a piece of the full-motion video game pie for themselves. Along with music company BMG, Sega funneled $12 million into the fledgling company, gaining themselves US publisher rights and console exclusivity. Reviewed in this issue of PC Zone is the first fruits of that partnership, a game called Loadstar, The Legend of Tully, Bodine. And while I don't want to spoil how well this is going to go, it's now so obscure I struggled badly to find a copy of the PC version anywhere, and then I couldn't get it to run. So here's the near identical Mega CD version, which was also something of a bitch to find.
Flight drop between the 56 Central, pick up our pay, and quickly on the rank. Let's see if we can scale up something semi-illegal. Right, Tully? We'll be burning out of here in about 4 hours.
If you're getting the Sewer Shark vibes from this, then you're not alone, because this is indeed a tunnel shooter with a massively overly elaborately filmed story. In the game proper then, it also absolutely gives Sewer Shark vibes, but it's neither as pretty nor as interesting. It's also massively clunky, since choosing how to turn at junctions is on the same controls as your weapons, and you're usually pretty busy. If you fail to make the right turns, this happens. You don't want this to happen. It's thin, to put it mildly. There's only 3 levels for your £35, and all of them are mildly warmed over versions of this train runner concept. You need to shoot the idiots flying around, you need to use the horn to annoy the people stopped in the middle of the track for some reason, but basically it's a slow, low enemy count shooter. The thing is though, I think this pile of crap has a legacy. This is the PC box art. Look at Tully's train-like truck flying down the magnetic rails. This is a concept image of Elon Musk and Tesla's Hyperloop magnetic high-speed train. It's the same bloody thing, isn't it? And, of course, you will quite sensibly say, well, that's coincidence, isn't it, Dudley? I mean, this is an incredibly obscure old PC game. Elon's a busy man. I doubt he's even heard of it. And you know, that's fair. So let's just sit back and enjoy the game's credit sequence. Oh yeah. Yes it is. Yes, that one. I bet you're feeling really stupid about that last comment now, aren't you? The reviewer for PC Zone on this one was one Charlie Brooker. Yes, again, that one. It's quite a month for celebrities on Yesterzine, isn't it? Charlie started at PC Zone and was there for several years. And unsurprisingly, when something was an utter pile of sheep shit, he didn't tend to hold back. In this case, a review with an extended metaphor involving a toilet. He's not a fan.
A perfect example of nothing at all, with nice FMV bits in it.
I can't disagree with him. It's simply a less good sewer shark, really. And that was Digital Pictures' worst game. It's a tremendous effort to get this thing working. The PC version is a DOS game on 4 CDs that'll play merry hell with your DOSBox config. The Mega CD version doesn't work in the most popular Mega Drive emulator Kega for some reason. In the absence of an actual Mega CD to hand, what you've been seeing here is a Raspberry Pi connected to an Elgato HD60 capture device and then to a PC. I've wasted my life. Rocket Science released 2 more heavily FMV based games. Cadillacs and Dinosaurs, the second Cataclysm, was a sequel to one of Capcom's more obscure beat-em-ups, which they chose to render as an FMV rail shooter. Wingnuts started life as a World War I fighter game, and well, you see where this is going. Financially, the games were a complete disaster. In as much as figures were available, it appears the total lifetime sales were less than 20,000. Which at least explains why I had so much trouble getting hold of even dodgy copies of them. To find out what happened, we called founder Steve Blank, and after questions like, "Why are you ringing me? It's 2:30 AM, can't this wait?" and "You think I sound like Bloggo's what?" he had the following to add.
We raised $35 million and after 18 months made the cover of Wired magazine. The press called Rocket Science one of the hottest companies in Silicon Valley and predicted that our games would be great because the storyboards and trailers were spectacular. 90 days later, I found out our games are terrible. No one is buying them, our best engineers started leaving, and with 120 people and a huge burn rate, we're running out of money and about to crash.
Sega's new multi-format publishing arm took control, and cancelled most of the games in production and slashed budgets. It worked about as well as you'd expect. They managed 2 more games before collapsing. Rocket Jockey was an innovative little future sports game, and Obsidian a well-regarded adventure game across 5 CDs. They sold, if anything, worse than their predecessors. The damage was done. CNET described the sales figures simply as grim. In April 1997, unable to find anyone to give them funding for another shot, Rocket Science closed, their name surviving on one more Sega-published game they originated, a more traditional adventure from Steve Moretsky, writer on the Zork and Hitchhiker's Guide adventure games. It too bombed. On the back page today, I've forgotten to actually ask anyone if they want to be featured, so let's thank some of this season's fantastic collaborators worthy of your Christmas view clicks. You heard Lefarius as Brett Sperry. His show Amigorama recently finished, but that just means you have a static target. Focusing on a single Amiga game an episode is exactly the kind of deep dive that if you stuck with this through the whole Loadstar segment, you're going to want to look up. And it's available as a podcast at amigorama.com. If you want a single episode recommendation, he geeked out on the wonderful Beneath the Steel Sky in episode 99. You, as I subtly indicated, heard Bloggo as Steve, that's really his name, not a script placeholder, blank. He's on a break right now, but if you want a bloke being honest in the way that only a man who is probably slightly regretting not writing a script can, we recommend the back catalogue. If we're recommending one episode, how about the fan service game special? Subscribe link after the credits. And of course, you know Kat aka Shin by now. If not, where were you last episode? The only person I know who can do flawless impressions of both Charlie Brooker and Teller. You'll find Shin hanging out on Twitch at twitch.tv/Kat aka Shin, with a range of extremely special guests, at least 2 of which you already know. So that's Season 2. There's more coming on this channel, including a passion project documentary about a developer you've never heard of, but I promise you've played their games. Also, a Yesterzine special about a game by Populous and Theme Park Legends Bullfrog that is too obscure to even have a Wikipedia page. Yesterzine Prime will be back in 2020 to continue educating and informing you about games good and bad and how we found out about them before the internet. If you want to request a magazine or comment on a previous one, you'll find me on Twitter or in the comments below. If you want timely notifications, I'm afraid you're going to need to click subscribe and the bell next to it, because YouTube's UX team are on the good drugs. In the meantime though, merry Yuletide commercial transaction season everyone. Ta-ra!